It was a soft summer morning when Alara first noticed him across the street, sunlight catching on his hair like strands of gold and her breath caught slightly, not because of his looks alone, though they were striking in that understated, easy kind of way that didn't seem like he was trying, but because he had the most open expression she'd ever seen, like he wasn't hiding a single thing from the world, and that struck her as rare, beautiful even, in a world that taught people to be guarded. And she, standing outside the small bookstore where she worked, watching him fumble with a paper cup and a bag of bagels, felt something stir that she didn't quite have a name for yet. Not that day, though it would come to her later, years later, maybe, in the hush of a shared breath or the stillness of an early morning when his arm was around her waist and she'd grown used to the rhythm of his breathing beside her. But that first day all she knew was that she wanted to see him again. And so, when he turned and walked into the coffee shop next to the bookstore, she slipped inside too, pretending she needed caffeine even though she just had tea, and she stood in line behind him, close enough to smell the faint scent of cedar and clean cotton and something sharper she couldn't place, maybe the edge of a secret, and she thought that was a ridiculous thing to think, that people didn't smell like secrets, but then he turned around and smiled at her, easy and warm, and said, "Hey, I think I've seen you before. Do you work at the bookstore?" And she nodded, startled into honesty, and said, "Yes," before quickly looking down at her shoes because his eyes were like the sea after a storm, that same mix of calm and wild, and it made her nervous, which wasn't usual for her, not anymore, not since she'd built up all her quiet defenses and learned to live inside the walls she'd built with care. But his voice made her feel like maybe she could lower them. Just a little, just enough to let some light in, and when he got his coffee and hesitated before heading to the door, she found herself saying, "Wait," without planning to, and he did, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she said, "What's your name?" And he smiled again and said, "Theo," and just like that it began, not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with a quiet conversation over coffee that turned into a walk around the block and then sitting on a park bench talking about books and dreams and why neither of them could stand pineapple on pizza and how they both secretly loved thunderstorms because the noise made them feel safe, like the world was holding its breath with them, and it was like that, every day after, like they had stepped into a story already half-written, with characters who fit too well to be coincidence, and days turned into weeks and weeks into months. And in that time Alara learned that Theo had a scar on his chin from falling off a bike when he was 9, that he used to build blanket forts with his sister even when they were too old for that kind of thing, that he carried a notebook everywhere and wrote poems in the margins of receipts and coffee sleeves, and he learned that Alara had once wanted to be an astronaut, that she cried during animated movies, that she had this laugh that only came out when she forgot to be careful, and he wanted to make her laugh like that all the time, and the way they fit was strange and perfect, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that somehow completed the same picture, and they weren't perfect, not always, they argued sometimes, like the time he forgot her birthday or the time she shut down instead of telling him what was wrong, but they always came back to each other, always found their way back with apologies and soft silences and hands reaching out in the dark, and there was a night in November, the sky thick with stars and cold, when they sat on the roof of her apartment with a blanket around their shoulders, and he said, "I think I'm falling in love with you," and she didn't say anything right away, just rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Me too," and the world kept turning, but it felt different after that, more vivid somehow, like they'd both started seeing in color for the first time. And they made pancakes at midnight and danced in the living room and left notes for each other on mirrors and fridge doors and inside books, and every moment felt stitched with something sacred, and they moved in together the following spring, into a tiny apartment with creaky floors and a view of the alley and the sweetest morning light, and they learned the rhythm of living together, of sharing space and time and silence, and some mornings he'd wake before her just to watch her sleep, and some nights she'd stay up late just to hear him talk about the stories he wanted to write, and there were hard days, of course there were, days when nothing made sense, and they snapped and misunderstood and needed space, but there was love, always love, in the way they came back, always came back, and on the 2-year anniversary of that first coffee shop encounter, he took her back to the park bench where they'd first really talked, and he pulled a ring from his coat pocket and asked, with shaking hands and tearful eyes, if she'd be his forever, and she said yes before he finished the question, and they kissed with the same wonder as the first time, and they got married. Under a canopy of fairy lights and stars and friends and all the words they'd ever spoken folded into the vows they wrote by hand, and their life together wasn't always easy, there were bills and loss and long nights and broken things, but it was theirs, and they chose each other every day, in coffee made just right and hugs that lasted too long and music shared and stories told and hands held through everything, and years passed like seconds, the way they do when you're living something true. And even when their hair grayed and the world changed around them, they still walked hand in hand, still laughed like they had in their 20s, still danced in kitchens, and when Theo passed, quietly, peacefully, in his sleep one morning in October, Elara held his hand and whispered, "Thank you for finding me," and though the days that followed felt hollow and heavy, she carried him in every breath, every sunrise, every page of every book they once shared. Because love, real love, doesn't end. It echoes. And hers would echo forever.